Hey guys, and welcome back to another Spore creation video. For this creation, I decided to make a one-shot build of a rainbow dragon. For those unfamiliar, what I call a one-shot build is essentially when a creation is so incredibly complex for the game that it cannot be rendered, it cannot be saved, it cannot be textured, or put into test mode, and therefore cannot be played with. So with dark injections and other freedom hacks, you have the complexity meter, as we're all horribly familiar with. We have the freedom cheat, which extends the complexity meter, but only by a set amount. And then you have the freedom hacks, which basically utterly destroy the complexity meter, but as a result, it does allow the ability for players to create so far beyond Spore's intended limit, where the game just doesn't really know what to do with it, and therefore, you know, it creates the aforementioned crash. And that is a thing that I like to play with every now and then, is to purposefully go far and beyond that limit. That way I can create, you know, like really insane over-the-top creations. And one I've been wanting to do for a very, very long time was a rainbow dragon. Now, the reason why I wanted to be rainbow specifically is because whenever I do this kind of creations, my colour palette is always extremely limited because I can't render it, I can't texture it, therefore I'm limited to the base colour. And that is it, only the base, so no patterns, no coats, no details, etc., only the base colour. And then whatever colours that the parts themselves inherit from it. And with dark injections, as you can see in the menu right now, a lot of the colours are oranges, purples, blues. So if I'm trying to make a red dragon, I can't use blues and purple parts, and they gotta be red, or maybe like warm colours like orange and yellow. They only have to be them parts. Therefore, because of that limitation, creating a rainbow dragon or rainbow creation wasn't necessarily possible. You could make it with a limited amount of colours, such as, you know, the ones available, but you can't make a full-on rainbow because there are not really colours like... there's not really like a nice, generous variety of coloured parts that you can really use for this. Kanban's colour pack was a great contender, but the colours don't show off until you render the creation, which again I could not do in this. And that is where Sides, the amazing, the mad scientist as he calls himself, he created the colour spheres and thus eventually coloured cones and coloured cubes in Pandora's toolbox. The major thing about those is that they actually colour the parts in while in edit mode. Thus, I am finally able to attempt this rainbow creation. So, the creation itself. I decided first things first was to go with the typical quadruped design. I wanted arms and legs and wings, typical very westernized form. But I wanted it to be sort of either on its hind legs or floating. Reason being is because I've done wyverns before. I personally think that having 4 legs offers, you know, more room, more real estate to put parts on, that, you know, kind of like, and, you know, up the complexity, which again is the entire point of a one-shot build, is to make it complex. And all these other kind of things, but I didn't want it to be just the same thing as the ones I've done before. The Great Red Dragon, everyone has seen that one. The Great Blue Dragon, which is not quite as well known, was an attempt at a kind of bipedal stance, but, you know, the traditional 4 legs, westernized appearance. And I didn't want to do that again. I wanted it to be intentionally different. And speaking of being different, to help obtain that goal, I decided to use a couple of parts I've never used before, and a couple of parts in ways I've never used before. So, such as for the wings, for example, the wings, the crest, these are all from Side's Box of Horrors, and they include a very interesting variety of parts, which I do not use anywhere as much as I should. This here was probably the first time I had used them. That way I could have a bit of the cresting around the chest, the head, and the wings, as, you know, a bit of a baseline appearance. And then I jumped into the first initial bit of colouring, which was the gemstone in the middle and the blue stripes down the side of the body. As another new technique, I had also used the fur pack, or the integument, I can never say the words, especially off the top of my head, the integrated integument, I'm not sure, it's a very unique name, but basically the fur pack, or the fur parts. And using those, I was able to use those because they were a white texture as opposed to nail downs, which are orange, or any of the texture spaceless parts, which are actually still coloured in their DI state in edit mode. So the fur parts ended up presenting to be a very nice, you know, large blocky mass which I could use with the creation. Speaking of which, the reason why the creation is white to begin with is that way, you know, if I was to have it any colour, in a rainbow creation, it would easily just become biased to that colour. And of course, I wanted there to be a bit of a neutralness to it, that way I can build in the colours into the creation. And I thought white would be a fairly neutral thing to start with. And also, I'm not entirely sure why, but the idea of a rainbow creation, it kind of felt a little bit divine, angelic. I'm not sure, like kind of like a deity sense in a way, and the wings kind of helped with that as well. Therefore, you know, kind of reinforcing the whole have a white texture thing to it. It was at a stage, or more like a minute ago in this stage, about where I decided the creation to be floating. Because I quite liked the pose and the posture the way it was. I quite liked the idea of it floating. Would have been very, very different compared to my other creations. And I could make it float because, after all, it's a one-shot creation, it's not going to animate. Animation just is not a factor, which means I really can do some really wild things. One of which being, you know, it floating. It has no graspers, no feet, no head. Stats just don't matter. It is entirely 100% about the aesthetic appearance. And thus, you know, got all the options to go crazy there. So at this stage I've had all the gems, like, well not the gems, more like the scale. I'm not really sure what they were meant to be, just colours in general going down the neck and the chest. Those would later on go down the entire length of the tail as well. At this point I'm also building up a little bit more in the crest around the head, as I felt like that the wing-like parts, as cool as they were, they're a little bit plain, so I'm going to add a little bit more in, you know, kind of add a bit here and there all over the place, get used to the design and understand what I'm trying to obtain here. For the tail had to be as large and grand as the wings and the rest of the creation itself. So in this stage I added some feathered parts, originally all green but figured to switch to the white ones as well. That way to create a bit of a variety. I wanted to do that all the way down to the base of the spine, but due to my placement and my technique, it wasn't really going to work out, not in such a way where it would all horribly overlap. So I did go with a bit of an abrupt end, probably a bit lazy, but I figured I could probably make up for it later on. I did try to maybe have them split out or split off in either side of the tail, but again, wasn't really liking it. I thought, okay, we'll just make up for it later on. But I did add a little bit of the feathers onto the wings as well. That way, it wasn't secluded just to the tail. It was like, you know, a bit in the creation as well, a bit in the body. At this point, I'm kind of experimenting between finding different parts of how to decorate the tail. And I ended up settling with these orange parts for now. The orange, because it was such a strong contrast, the shape meant I could have on the base of the tail as a sort of like an armor underbelly plating, while also protruding, creating a spike into the rest of the tail. I quite like the technique at the start. I especially do like the spikes that protrude on the backside, but I ended up removing this entirely later in favour of a new technique. And also because the large orange mat is a bit horrible to look at compared to the rest of the creation, and that becomes more and more evident as we go on. It is in this stage here where I decide to finally create the feathers for the creation, or for the wings. So my idea for a rainbow dragon had always been very large, very colourful rainbow wings. Like I said, it's a concept I've wanted to do for a very, very long time because it's so alien in Spore to have anything truly like a rainbow. And let's face it, I don't know about you guys, but I can't really imagine rainbow webbed wings. I'm sure it's possible, no doubt, but not in such a style that actually look good in Spore. If they were iridescent, then absolutely. But iridescence is simply not a possible thing in this game. Feathers, however, feathers can be mimicked, and that was a goal here. And this stage certainly took quite a while to complete, but in the end I really did like the overall outcome of the wings. A bit more could have been done, and a bit more was to be done, but unfortunately the creation crashed before I was even remotely close to finishing. So while the wings were big and epic and rainbowish, they were also a little bit plain, or as a consequence of said crash. Satisfied with the overall look of the wings, I decided to duplicate the parts entirely and create a bit of a bizarre split in the wings. It anatomically makes no sense. It is arguably a bit of a lazy thing to do, but it was as simple as I wanted to add more to the wings, wanted to have more weight, again more complexity. That is again the entire point of this, you know, great complexity, and therefore I just figured, screw it, let's just duplicate it. And there was going to be another thing that later on in the creation I'd go ahead and, you know, try to make up for it with other details. Maybe a couple of spikes, a couple of bits of fur, or maybe like whiskers and such coming off the wings in some way. I don't entirely know. It was just one of those kind of decisions in the moment of improv, and I'd continue to improv and create more for it. After finishing the wings and being overall satisfied with the complete rainbow appearance of them, it was at this point where I really figured to myself, yeah, the tail just was not cutting it. The great big orange mass really was far too much, and it was just simply a lazy solution. So I removed the entire orange mass and decided to try and mimic this rainbow design in the form of spikes and a tail. This definitely was reaching a point where I was worrying if it was a little bit too rainbow, but then, you know, I had to remind myself that the entire point of this creation is to be over the top. It might look tacky, it might look goldy, but at the end of the day, that is the entire point, was just this great big colourful mass. So I simply cracked on and created an entire rainbow of spikes running down the back, up until the tip of the head, and just behind the feathers on the tail. Satisfied with the overall row of colourful spikes, I then tried to add in a little bit more of a neutral tone to the spikes, and I also have some Adora visors, the creepy and cute vanilla part. Those are a nice, you know, simple white, or more like a textureless part. They kind of inherit the colours of the base creation, with a bit of a like outlining, or a bit of a what's the word, accent to it. So overall, it wasn't like a pure white, but it was enough of a nice neutral addition to the mane, if you will, to the spikes running down the neck, that I thought would just kind of not have the rainbow spikes be so bare and alone. It just added, again, like another minor layer of complexity, kind of made them stand out a little bit more, and kind of just added an overall weight to the neck and made things just a little bit bigger, a little bit puffier, not quite as scrawny. With the fur parts mentioned earlier, the fur parts flipped upside down to create the underbelly armor plating. I went ahead and mimicked that technique throughout the entirety of the tail. That way to keep it all nice and consistent, a little bit less boring. And I went ahead and used the pale blue stripe I used around the neck and the chest, continued that all the way down the tail as well. I decided to keep it at a vertical level, or vertical angle. Even though it ended up being significantly more parts, you know, I was confident in the fact that it was going to last anyway. And also that would create a bit of a nice, it'd create a bit of a balance between, one, a bit of a nice pattern, just something more to look at, and two, it kind of gives off the illusion of even more complexity, even more noise, just more things happening. Looking back on it in hindsight, so this right here may have potentially been the reason why the game crashed, I don't know. Maybe I just simply got too carried away with it. When it comes to one-shot builds, I'm used to the fact that it's going to crash, but what's a bit of a hilarious irony I've kind of realised lately, or noticed lately even, with my game? Something has changed, and I seem to crash more often while saving than I do at any other point. So the very backwards logic here, and based on observation, I'm not going that insane yet, more than I already am. The backwards logic here was that by continuously adding more and more parts and not prompting the game to save or to render or texture or anything like that, I would be fine. And that is normally the running theme in these one-shot creations. I am typically fine. I can throw on hundreds upon hundreds of parts, it'd be absolutely fine. But what ended up happening with this creation was a very, very simple, singular, vanilla part that I put on what was going to be the head. The game just didn't like it, did not like it, froze up and crashed. Simple as that. So at this stage of the creation, the Adora visor part I mentioned earlier going down the neck and the back, I then mimicked along the rest of the tail as well. Not entirely, not all the way there, but enough of it so that again just adds a little bit more weight and depth. And I also decided to add a bit of a darker blue stripe among the pale blue stripe. Again, more complexity. I feel like I'm a bit of a broken record here, but that really is just the entire point. And I suppose a little bit more contrast, and I wanted to emphasise the whole rainbow part. Maybe a couple of segments of the body would only be certain, you know, like have a limited palette, but still not be just a singular or dual colour scheme. You can see here that I biased the stripes down to the lower half of the blue stripe. That way it would allow room to add in another colour. I was thinking maybe orange or yellow, again like a very nice contrast. But I didn't really get to the phase of doing that, unfortunately. But once I'd finally added the blue stripe along the entirety of the tail, I finally started working on the head. The head was going to be a fully custom made piece. using the creepy and cute horror lamps over the parts, with some flipped over nail downs for the jawbone or cheekbone or whatever, that whole general area, using a couple of death spikes, another creepy and cute part for the teeth, and then to just start layering various other parts on top. This is the stage where the creation crashed, to which I was extremely disappointed. Like I said, I really expected to be able to last a lot longer with this. The game failed me, the creation was very, very prematurely lost, and in the end, what can you do? I'll try this idea out again in the future, but sadly, not today. Thank you guys for watching, and I hope it was interesting.